My girlfriend claims she searched every vet in the state to find Buster, but he's at a clinic 20 minutes away, and they've never received a call from her. For the past 4 weeks, I've been visiting my autistic brother's support dog there every day. Zane is 7 and has had Buster for 3 years. That dog learned to play hide and seek because it made Zane laugh and knew his meltdowns were coming before we did. The night Buster disappeared, my girlfriend Christy called me in tears. She was crying that the thunderstorm had spooked Buster, and he somehow got through the back gate. By the time Zane and I got home, she already had flyers designed on her laptop. By morning, she was a one-woman search party. She'd created spreadsheets tracking which shelters she'd called, timestamps, and contact names. She'd joined every lost pet Facebook group within 100 miles and even promised cash rewards. All while Zane kept asking me if Buster ran away because of him and wrote letters to Santa saying he knows it's July, but can he please have Buster back? 3 days after Buster vanished, I couldn't sleep. I decided to check North Point Emergency Veterinary, the emergency vet 20 minutes away. Christy's spreadsheet listed dozens of vets, all marked contacted, but how quickly she'd supposedly reach them all made me want to verify. Buster was at this clinic, already skinnier and looking dangerously infected. He barely wagged his tail when he saw me. He was brought in severely dehydrated, his paws cut from running on concrete. The vet said he looked like he'd been out for days. I paid for his treatment but didn't take him home. He needed multiple surgeries and weeks of rehabilitation to walk again. At first I wanted to tell Christy, but not Zane. The plan was to surprise him with Buster walking through the door, fully healed, tail wagging. But on the drive home, something seriously nagged at me. Our back gate has a 2-step latch mechanism. Zane's occupational therapist specifically recommended it for safety. You have to lift and slide. Buster is trained to never approach gates. Even in terror, his training should hold. Plus, Christy kept changing how long it took her to notice. Sometimes it was 10 minutes, other times 20. The next morning, I put my theory to the test by casually suggesting checking the veterinary clinics again in case Buster showed up today. Christy started touching her neck. No need. I already called every vet in the state today. In the whole state? Whole state. She stared straight at me, clearly nervous. I pretended to believe her. In reality, I started visiting Buster. I'd leave work early sometimes and come home late. I'd help with Buster's physical therapy, watching him slowly get better. Then at home, start planting seeds in Zane's mind, telling him I talked to Santa and he said he'd seen what he can do. But Christy was getting suspicious. 1 week in, she found a receipt in my jacket. $500 at North Point Emergency Veterinary. She confronted me immediately, claiming I'd gotten a secret pet. No mention of Buster. I panicked and said I'd loaned money to a coworker for their cat. She walked away but clearly didn't buy it. I realized she was keeping an eye out when she found dog hair on my clothes. Not just any fur, but Buster's distinctive pattern. She asked if I'd found Buster with this fake excitement in her voice. And when I said no, I saw relief practically wash over her. Zane had heard and started crying. That week she checked my phone location history and saw I'd been visiting North Point. She actually called them asking about Buster. Luckily, I'd been prepared and told them to say no. Soon, her intensified from angered interest to pure panic. She started demanding, "Which vets did you check? We need to coordinate our lists. Show me exactly where you've been looking." When I mentioned I'd been checking some places independently, she went white, started calling vets frantically, asking if they had Buster, if anyone had asked about him. Yesterday, I finally brought Buster home. Zane heard the bark from upstairs. He flew down faster than I've ever seen him move. Buster nearly knocked him over, tail wagging so hard his whole body shook, licking Zane's face while Zane sobbed and laughed and made these hiccuping sounds of pure joy. They rolled on the floor together, Buster trying to climb into Zane's lap, despite being 70 pounds, and Zane putting his hands in a boxing stance. Buster clearly still remembered from the way his paws went into what looked like a stance too. I was filming the moment to remember it forever, but then Buster saw Christy. His happiness vanished. He put his tail between legs and started backing away, whimpering even. Christy's face made me stop recording. Her face wasn't relief, wasn't joy. It was the expression of someone whose worst nightmare just walked through the door. She stood frozen, watching Zane clutch Buster, watching Buster press himself against the wall to maximize distance from her. "You found him," she said. Her voice was completely flat. "At North Point." "Yes, I did. Where you apparently looked every day." Zane looked up, still holding Buster tight. "Why is he scared of you?" Silence. Buster whimpered again, trying to squeeze behind my legs while keeping his eyes on Christy. "You opened the gate," I said to Christy, trying to keep my voice steady. But even Helen Keller would have been able to tell I was angry. And what Christy responded with, it made Zane cry and Buster lunge at her. She said Buster was better off dead than living with us, that she wished the vet hadn't saved him. The words hit like a physical blow, and before I could react, Buster launched himself forward with a snarl I'd never heard from him, teeth bared, and I had to grab his collar with both hands to hold him back while he strained against me, all 70 pounds of muscle trying to get at her. My hands were shaking as I pulled Zane behind me with one arm, while keeping my grip on Buster's collar with the other, and I heard myself telling Christy to get out of our house right now, my voice cracking on the words. She stood there frozen, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find something to say that might undo what just happened. But Zane was sobbing so hard into Buster's fur that his whole body shook, and the dog kept growling low in his throat, a sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. Christy took a step back, and I told her if she didn't leave immediately I was calling the police, and something in my face must have convinced her because she grabbed her purse and headed for the door, then turned back like she wanted to explain, but I just pointed at the door, and she finally left, slamming it so hard that the framed pictures on the wall rattled, and one actually fell, the glass cracking when it hit the floor. I locked the deadbolt and put the chain on, my fingers fumbling with the metal, then sank down next to Zane, who was still crying into Buster's neck, while the dog licked his face and whined softly. And when Zane asked me why she hurt Buster, I didn't have any good answer for a 7-year-old, so I just held them both while we sat there on the floor. That night, my phone buzzed constantly with texts from Christy, and when I finally looked, she was claiming Buster was never in real danger, that she just needed him gone for a few days to think, that I was overreacting, and she loved Zane like family. But I took screenshots of every message and then blocked her number, my stomach churning at how she was already trying to rewrite what happened. I knew we needed help processing this, so I called Magdalene Quinn, Zane's occupational therapist, and when I explained what happened, she immediately agreed to come over first thing in the morning for an emergency session, her voice tight with concern. Zane wouldn't leave my room that night, curling up in my bed with Buster stretched out across the doorway like a furry barricade, and every time there was a noise outside, the dog's head would snap up, alert and ready. already. The next morning when I tried to let Buster out for his bathroom break, he wouldn't go near the kitchen door that leads to the backyard, backing away and whimpering, his tail tucked between his legs, and I had to coax him out of the front door instead, walking him on his leash in our own yard. Magdalene arrived at 9 and immediately noticed how Buster kept positioning himself between Zane and every entrance, following us from room to room and pressing against Zane's legs whenever we stopped moving, and she said this was classic trauma response behavior, that the dog was in protective mode. While she worked with Zane in the living room, using his favorite building blocks to help him process his feelings, I went into the home office where Christy's laptop sat abandoned on the desk, still logged into her accounts, and my hands trembled as I opened her search history. There it was, clear as day. Searches from the night Buster disappeared showing she'd looked up how far dogs run. When scared at 11 p.m., a full hour before she called me crying about the thunderstorm, and I felt sick as I took photos of every page with my phone, the timestamp proving she'd planned this. Her famous spreadsheet was still open in another tab, the one she'd shown me so proudly with all the shelters she'd supposedly contacted, but when I looked closer, every single call was marked as exactly 5 minutes long, down to the second, which seemed impossible. And when I called 3 of the shelters myself, speaking to actual people, they had no record of anyone calling about a lost service dog, no flyers received, nothing. The elaborate search effort, the tears, the Facebook posts, all of it was completely fake, just theater to cover what she'd done, and I documented everything, taking screenshots and photos until my phone storage was almost full. My phone rang, and it was Dr. Susanna Becker from North Point calling to check on Buster's recovery, and she mentioned something odd that had been bothering her, that the person who dropped him off was wearing a hoodie, despite it being a warm July night, had paid cash and refused to leave any contact information, just said they'd found him wandering and left immediately. I wonder why Christy searched about scared dogs running an hour before she claimed the storm happened. That timing feels really strange to me. Plus all those shelter calls being exactly 5 minutes each. Nobody times their desperate search calls that perfectly when their boyfriend's brother's service dog is missing. The timing matched perfectly with when Christy claimed to be out searching the neighborhood, driving around looking for him, and Dr. Becker said she'd be happy to provide a written statement about the suspicious circumstances if I needed it for any legal proceedings. After Magdalene left, telling me she'd document everything for Zane's medical records, I walked over to Turner Malone's house since I remembered he'd installed one of those doorbell cameras that captures the whole street after some packages went missing last year. Turner pulled up the footage on his computer, and we watched together as a figure in a dark hoodie walked past his house around 11:30 that night, clearly leading a large dog on a leash. The quality wasn't great because of the rain, but you could tell it was someone my height and build dragging Buster, who kept trying to pull back toward our house. Turner's neighbor had a better angle, and when he called them over, they brought their laptop with clearer footage, showing the same person returning 40 minutes later without the dog, and the partial license plate matched Christy's Honda. I thanked them both and took copies of everything on a USB drive Turner gave me, then headed home where Christy was pacing in the living room, while Zane sat on the floor with Buster pressed against him. "You need to leave," I told her, keeping my voice steady while Zane covered his ears. "Get out right now, and we'll arrange for you to get your stuff when we're not here." She started yelling that I was poisoning Zane against her, that I always put him and that dog before our relationship, and before she slammed the door, she turned and said she was sick of her whole life revolving around autism schedules and dog therapy sessions. The stress of dealing with all this while trying to keep Zane calm meant I'd been missing work, and the next morning my supervisor called to say HR needed documentation for my 4 absences this week, or I'd face disciplinary action. I couldn't exactly explain that my girlfriend had tried to kill my brother's service dog, so I mumbled something about a family emergency and promised to bring paperwork. That afternoon, Dr. Becker emailed me Buster's complete medical records showing severe dehydration, infected paw wounds consistent with running on concrete for days, and treatment notes indicating whoever dropped him off claimed to have found him wandering, but somehow knew his name was Buster. She included a formal statement about the suspicious circumstances and said she'd testify if needed. Fisher Hammond from Animal Control returned my call later that day and explained that proving animal abuse required clear evidence of intent to harm, not just negligence. He looked at the doorbell footage and vet records I'd gathered, but said while helpful, it probably wasn't enough for criminal charges, though he suggested filing a report anyway to create an official paper trail. After he left, I went outside to look at our gate more carefully in daylight and found fresh scratches on the metal latch mechanism that looked like tool marks from pliers or a screwdriver being used to force it open. I took photos from every angle, getting close-ups of the damage that definitely wasn't there before Buster disappeared. Going through our joint bank account online, I discovered Christy had withdrawn $300 cash the day before Buster vanished, with the ATM timestamp showing 8 p.m. when she told me she was at book club until 10. Another $200 withdrawal showed up the morning she supposedly started her frantic search for him. I sent her an email with screenshots of everything, the ATM records, the fake search spreadsheet, the doorbell footage, and the vet records, asking her to explain all these inconsistencies. She replied with this long, rambling message about how I never understood the pressure she felt, how Zane and Buster took all my emotional energy, and she felt invisible in her own home, and while she wouldn't admit to deliberately releasing him, she said maybe it was subconsciously intentional, which made no sense. I was on the phone with Magdalene discussing everything when Zane overheard me say Christy hurt Buster on purpose, and he had a complete meltdown, screaming and hitting himself while Buster immediately went into service mode. The dog did this thing called deep pressure therapy, where he laid across Zane's legs to calm him, staying perfectly still despite Zane screaming and flailing, and it still took 2 hours before we could get him calm enough to eat some crackers for dinner. Magdalene came for another another emergency session the next day and brought official documentation showing Buster was registered as a medical necessity for Zane's autism management. She explained that what Christy did could legally be considered interference with medical equipment, like if someone had stolen a wheelchair or destroyed an oxygen tank, and she wrote a detailed letter for any legal proceedings we might pursue. Turner stopped by that evening, saying his neighbor had found even better footage from their side camera, showing the hooded figure more clearly. And when we watched it, you could see them returning empty-handed exactly 40 minutes after leaving with the dog, with enough of the license plate visible to confirm it was definitely Christy's Honda. He saved everything to another USB drive and said he'd already made backup copies in case we needed them for court, and I realized how lucky we were to have neighbors who actually cared enough to help. That night after Zane went to bed, I sat down with my laptop and started going through Christy's Facebook posts from when Buster was missing. She'd posted every few hours about searching for him with crying emojis and photos of the flyers she'd made, but something didn't add up when I looked closer at the timestamps. At 2 in the morning, she posted about driving around the neighborhood calling for Buster, but the post location showed she was at home on our couch. Another post at 4 a.m. claimed she was checking the park, but Facebook's location data put her at Wine and Design downtown, where she goes with her book club friends. I took screenshots of everything, especially the one where she wrote about being out all night searching when the location clearly showed she never left the house. 3 days later, I walked into the police station with a folder full of evidence, including Turner's USB drives and all my screenshots. The officer at the desk sent me to Animal Control, where I met Fisher Hammond, who looked through everything while shaking his head. He told me the district attorney almost never takes these cases because they're hard to prove, but when I mentioned Buster was a registered service dog, his whole attitude changed. He made copies of everything and said they'd call Christy in for questioning, which made my stomach flip because I knew she'd figure out I was behind it. The next week, the police called to tell me Christy had come in with her lawyer and stuck to her story about the gate accidentally opening during the storm. But then she messed up and admitted she thought maybe a few days without Buster would be good for everyone to reset and get some space. The officer said that counted as deliberate endangerment of a service animal, and they were forwarding it to the district attorney, even though charges were unlikely. Meanwhile, my boss called me into his office because HR had flagged my attendance as a problem with all the days I'd missed dealing with this mess. I had to sit there and explain the whole situation to strangers in HR, who kept asking for documentation about the family emergency while I tried not to lose it. They finally gave me 3 days of emergency leave, but said if I missed any more work, I'd be fired, which meant I couldn't afford to keep the house for Zane. I called Turner and asked if he could supervise while Christy came to get her stuff, because I didn't trust her alone in the house with access to Zane's things. He agreed immediately, and the next Saturday, Christy showed up with boxes and started packing while Turner sat in the living room reading a newspaper. He told me later she cried the entire 4 hours it took her to pack, and kept asking him if I'd said anything about maybe working things out. She left behind every single thing Zane had ever given her, including the birthday drawings he'd made, and the Mother's Day card from last year that said, "Best almost mom ever," which made me want to throw up when I found it. That afternoon, Dr. Becker called with news that made everything click into place. North Point's parking lot camera had caught someone dropping Buster off, and while the footage was too dark to see faces clearly, the person's height and the way they walked matched Christy perfectly. She emailed me the video, even though she said the clinic usually never shares security footage, but she wanted to help after seeing what Buster went through. I watched it 20 times, seeing the hooded figure carry Buster to the door, leave him there, and drive away in what looked exactly like Christy's Honda. While putting Christy's abandoned desk stuff in a box, I found a notebook shoved in the back of a drawer, and when I opened it, my hands started shaking. Page after page of her writing about feeling trapped, and how she fantasized about life without that dog always in the way. 2 weeks before Buster disappeared, she'd written, "If something happened to that dog, maybe things could go back to normal and I could have my boyfriend back," which I photographed with my phone immediately. The worst part was finding an entry where she described practicing with the gate latch to see if she could make it look broken. I remembered our iPad was still logged into her account, so I checked the location history, and there it was like a smoking gun. Her device showed she was at North Point Emergency Veterinary at 2 in the morning, the night Buster vanished, and she stayed for exactly 12 minutes, which would be just enough time to drop him off and leave. I took photos of the screen showing the map with a timestamp, and her device name clearly visible because I knew this was the proof I needed. At 3 a.m. a few nights later, my phone buzzed with an email from Christy that went on for pages about how this was all a mental health crisis, and she never meant for Buster to get hurt. Christy's writing about practicing with the gate latch makes me really curious about her thought process. Like she planned this whole thing, but somehow didn't think about security cameras or digital footprints. She actually wrote the phrase, "I was just rehoming him temporarily for everyone's benefit," like Buster was some piece of furniture she could put in storage when it got inconvenient. She kept saying she loved Zane and never wanted to hurt him, but thought their relationship was too dependent and unhealthy, and maybe some time apart would help him grow. I forwarded it all to Fisher and my lawyer without responding to her. The next morning, Magdalene came over for Zane's regular session, and afterward we sat in the kitchen discussing what to do next. She pointed out that dragging this through criminal court could take months and might be harder on Zane than just getting a protective order and moving on with our lives. We both agreed the most important thing was keeping Christy away from Zane and Buster while maintaining their routines and sense of safety, even if it meant she never faced real consequences for what she did. The next day, Fisher Hammond called while I was making Zane breakfast and told me the district attorney wouldn't move forward without clearer proof that Christy meant to hurt Buster. He suggested filing for a protective order instead, which would at least keep her away from us even if it wasn't real justice. I thanked him and started Googling family lawyers that same morning while Zane ate his cereal and Buster sat guard by the door like he'd been doing since we got home. I found a lawyer who specialized in protective orders and made an appointment for that afternoon using the vacation money I'd been saving since January. She looked through all my evidence for over an hour, the vet records, and location, data, and doorbell footage, and Magdalene's letter, then said we had a really strong case for a civil protection order. The retainer alone was $1,500, and she said the total would probably hit $3,000, but I signed the papers anyway because keeping Zane safe was worth eating ramen for the next 6 months. That evening after dinner, I sat Zane down at the kitchen table with Buster pressed against his leg and explained that Christy had made some bad choices and wouldn't be living with us anymore. He asked if she was going to jail, and I had to find the right words to explain that sometimes people who do bad things don't get punished the way they should, which made him frown and clutch Buster tighter. He seemed to get it though, and just wanted to know if Buster was safe now, so I promised him nobody would ever take Buster away again. 2 weeks later, the court date arrived, and I walked into the courthouse with my lawyer while my parents watched Zane at home. Christy showed up in this dark blue suit I'd never seen before with her own lawyer who looked expensive, and she kept her eyes down the whole time dabbing at them with a tissue like she was the victim here. When we got called up, her lawyer started talking about how this was just a momentary lapse in judgment during a mental health crisis, and how Christy was getting therapy now, and deeply regretted her actions. My lawyer presented everything we had starting with the vet records that showed Buster's injuries and dehydration, then the location data, proving Christy was at North Point at 2 a.m., and the doorbell footage showing someone in a hoodie carrying Buster away. The judge looked really interested when we showed him the notebook I'd found with all her writing about wanting Buster gone, and the fake spreadsheet she'd made to look like she was searching for him. Christy's lawyer tried to object, saying the notebook was private thoughts, but the judge said it showed intent and allowed it as evidence. After an hour of back and forth, the judge granted a temporary protective order that said Christy had to stay 500 feet away from our house, and from Zane and Buster, and she also had to pay half of Buster's vet bills within 30 days. It wasn't the criminal conviction she deserved for what she did, but at least we had legal protection now, and she couldn't come near us without getting arrested. 3 days later, the landlord called about the lease since Christy's name was still on it, and said I either needed to find someone to take over her half of the rent or break the lease with a 2-month penalty. Moving would mess up all of Zane's routines, but I couldn't afford $1,600 a month by myself, so I started posting ads for a roommate while trying to figure out if my parents could help with money. That same week, Buster's front left paw got infected where one of the deeper cuts was, and started swelling up with this gross yellow discharge that smelled awful. Dr. Becker put him on another round of antibiotics that cost $200, and said we'd need to change the bandages twice a day, which meant buying more supplies and teaching Zane how to help without hurting him. My credit card was already maxed from the lawyer fees, and now this pushed me over the limit, so Becker offered a payment plan where I could pay $50 a month, which helped, but still meant more debt piling up. Around this time, Zane started having these bad nightmares, where he'd wake up screaming that Buster was gone, and we'd have to turn on all the lights and show him Buster was still there sleeping by his bed. He started insisting on checking every door and window, and the back gate multiple times before bed, which turned into this whole routine where he and Buster would do a security check together, walking through each room. It helped calm him down, but added another half hour to bedtime, when he was already staying up too late from anxiety, and I was exhausted from everything else. Then the calls started coming from mutual friends who said Christy was devastated and wanted to apologize properly, and maybe we could all sit down and talk about this like adults. I had to explain over and over that she deliberately hurt a disabled kid's service animal and left him to potentially die, and I didn't care about her feelings or her apologies. About half of them said I was being too harsh, and that everyone deserves a second chance, while the other half understood once I explained the full story, but it still hurt losing friends over this. Fisher Hammond called me 2 days later to say Animal Control was closing their investigation without filing any criminal charges against Christy, though they were keeping a record of the incident in case she ever had another animal-related problem. He sounded disappointed when he explained that without clearer proof of intent to harm, the district attorney wouldn't pursue it, but at least if she ever did something like this again, they'd have this report showing a pattern. I thanked him for trying and hung up feeling like justice had slipped through our fingers again. That night after Zane went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table going through old photos on my phone and started seeing all the warning signs I'd missed. There was that time Christy rolled her eyes when I had to leave dinner early because Buster was having stomach issues and Zane needed help. She'd complained about dog hair on her black pants before job interviews, and once said we should get one of those outdoor kennels so Buster wouldn't track mud inside. She even joked at her sister's wedding that life would be so much easier without having to plan everything around a dog's schedule, and everyone laughed while I just thought she was venting about normal pet stuff. My mom called the next morning offering to help with rent money for a few months since Christy moving out meant I couldn't afford the $1,600 a month by myself. They lived in Oregon and couldn't help with Zane's daily care, but Mom said they could send $500 a month through the holidays if it would help keep things stable. I hated taking their money, but accepted because keeping Zane in the same house with his routines was more important than my pride. While I was cleaning Zane's room that afternoon, I found a piece of paper under his bed that made me stop everything. He'd written another letter to Santa in his shaky handwriting, thanking him for bringing Buster home and saying he didn't need any Christmas presents this year because getting Buster back was enough. I put it in the folder with his desperate July letter, begging Santa to help find Buster, and seeing them together showed exactly how awful this whole summer had been. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize, but when I played it, Christy's voice filled the kitchen saying she'd started therapy and was beginning to understand how wrong she'd been about everything. She claimed she never meant for Buster to actually get hurt, and wondered if there was any way to make amends or at least explain herself properly to help everyone heal. I deleted the message, but not before recording it on my laptop, in case we ever needed more evidence for legal stuff. Turner knocked on our door that evening carrying a box of security equipment, saying he was upgrading his whole system and thought we might want to connect some cameras since everything that happened. Zane had been showing him how Buster could shake hands and play dead, and Turner always acted amazed even though he'd seen these tricks a dozen times already. He helped me install a camera by the back gate and another by the front door, refusing to let me pay him and just saying neighbors look out for each other. 3 days later, we had Buster's final follow-up appointment at North Point, where Dr. Becker handed me a thick folder with every single medical record, photo, and treatment note from Buster's stay. She said if we ever needed testimony for insurance claims or any legal proceedings, she'd be happy to help because in 30 years of practicing veterinary medicine, she'd rarely seen such deliberate cruelty disguised as an accident. Her saying that out loud somehow made me feel less crazy for knowing what Christy did was on purpose. We were walking back from the park the next afternoon when a silver Honda that looked exactly like Christy's car drove slowly past our house, causing Buster to immediately start panic barking and trying to hide behind my legs while shaking. Something strange about that protective order only being 500 feet. That's less than 2 blocks in most neighborhoods, which seems really close for someone who hurt a service dog dog? The car kept going, but Buster stayed terrified for 20 minutes. And when I called Magdalene about it, she said trauma responses like this could last months, and we'd need to work on desensitization exercises. She came over the next day to show us calming techniques, having Zane practice deep breathing with Buster, and teaching them both to do progressive muscle relaxation together. The protective order hearing happened a week later, and Christy didn't even contest it, her lawyer just saying she wanted to move forward and put everything behind her. The judge made the order permanent for 2 years, with the possibility of renewal if needed, and Christy had to stay 500 feet away from our house, Zane, and Buster at all times. It wasn't the criminal conviction she deserved, but at least we had legal protection that would get her arrested if she came near us. I posted an ad for a roommate that same day, and got a response from a graduate student named Amy, who was studying special education at the university. She came to meet us and immediately got down on the floor to let Buster sniff her hand, then asked Zane about his favorite subjects at the school, and actually listened to his 10-minute explanation about dinosaurs. She said living with someone on the spectrum would actually be good experience for her career, and offered to pay $600 a month plus help with groceries. When she moved in the next weekend, she brought a label maker and asked Zane to help her learn where everything went in the kitchen, making it into a game that had him laughing for the first time in weeks. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in Zane's classroom with his teacher and the school counselor while Buster lay at my feet. I kept it simple, just saying there'd been a family situation over the summer that might affect him. The teacher nodded and said she'd noticed Zane seemed more anxious during their back-to-school orientation. The counselor asked if Buster would be coming to the school every day, and I said yes, he's medically necessary. They both agreed to watch for any behavioral changes, and the counselor promised to check in with Zane weekly. The principal stopped by and mentioned how important Buster was for Zane's success last year, especially during fire drills. That same afternoon, the mail brought the final vet bill from North Point, and even with the payment plan, it was brutal. $4,300 total, with Christy's court-ordered half coming in tiny monthly payments. I called my parents that night, and my mom wired another month's rent before mentioning maybe Zane should come live with them in Florida. She said it gently, but it still stung, like I couldn't handle taking care of my own brother. My dad got on the phone and said they just wanted to help however they could. I thanked them and said we were managing, even though my credit cards were maxed and I'd been eating ramen for lunch all week. 3 days later, I heard laughing from upstairs and found Zane and Buster playing hide-and-seek for the first time since everything happened. Buster was crouched behind the bathroom door, while Zane counted loudly in the hallway. When Zane found him, Buster did his wiggle dance and Zane laughed so hard he got hiccups. They played 3 more rounds, but Buster wouldn't go near the stairs that led to the back door. Even during the game, he kept checking over his shoulder, like he was making sure the gate was still closed. These little moments felt huge after weeks of Zane barely smiling. Amy watched from her doorway and asked if this was normal, and I said yeah, they'd been playing this game for years. 6 weeks had passed since that awful night when I found myself making dinner, and realized I hadn't thought about Christy as my girlfriend in weeks. She wasn't my ex or my former partner in my head anymore. She was just the person who hurt Buster, who made Zane cry, who betrayed our trust. The anger had burned through all the relationship grief, until there was just tired determination left. I was chopping vegetables when Turner knocked on the door with a casserole his wife made. He mentioned his daughter handles civil suits and could maybe help recover damages beyond the vet bills. I thanked him, but said I was too tired to fight anymore. He nodded and said, sometimes you have to accept that partial justice is all you get. His wife had written heating instructions on a sticky note and drawn a smiley face. The next morning, Zane was eating cereal when he looked up and asked if Christy would ever come back. I told him no, she won't ever come back. He nodded and said, that's good because Buster doesn't like her, and Buster is smart about people. The simple truth of it hit me hard, but I just agreed and poured myself coffee. Buster was lying under the table, and his tail thumped once when Zane said his name. Amy had been living with us for a week when she asked to learn Buster's commands in case of emergencies. She sat on the living room floor with a notebook while Zane demonstrated each one. He showed her the hand signal for deep pressure therapy and explained how Buster could sense meltdowns coming. She took notes like she was in class, asking about response times and weight distribution. When Zane mentioned Buster was medical equipment, not just a pet, she nodded seriously and said she understood. She treated the whole thing like important information she needed to know, not just humoring a kid. Zane showed her the special whistle pattern that meant Buster should find an adult if Zane couldn't speak. She practiced it until she got it right and Buster responded correctly. It was such a relief having someone who understood without me having to explain why this mattered. 8 weeks after that horrible night, we'd settled into something that worked, even if it wasn't perfect. The protective order was solid and would last 2 years. Zane felt safe enough to sleep in his own bed again with Buster on the floor beside him. Buster was healing well, though he still limped on cold mornings. We were managing the bills with help from my parents and Amy's rent. The house felt calmer without Christy's mood swings and passive-aggressive comments about dog hair. Justice had been messy and partial, but we were still standing. Zane was back at the school with support systems in place. Buster was playing again even if he avoided certain parts of the house. Amy fit into our routine without drama or complaint. We'd survived the worst summer of our lives and built something new from what was left. That had to be enough because it was all we had. Thanks for hanging out while I explored all these questions. Hopefully my wondering out loud wasn't too much. I'll catch you around next time. Like the video. It helps more than you think.